Hi, I'm Kevin Ryan, staff writer at Inc. Magazine, and today we're joined by Steve Case. Steve is co-founder of AOL, chairman of the fund Revolution, and author of The Third Wave. Steve, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Kevin.
Just to kind of set the stage a little bit, why don't you tell us a little bit about Revolution and the various funds that you all have there?
Well, we started Revolution about 15 years ago after I stepped aside as CEO of AOL. We started AOL back in 1985, 35 years ago this summer, believe it or not. Back then, only 3% of people were online. They're only online 1 hour a week. So it's amazing now we're living in this Zoom land and living most of our lives online, because 35 years ago, nobody really knew or cared about the internet. Most people were suspicious that it ever amount to much. Anyway, I did that for about 20 years and then decided to invest in the next generation of entrepreneurs, be a mentor, a partner, an ally for entrepreneurs trying to take on big problems. And that led to launching Revolution, and we've evolved over the years. Now we have three groups within Revolution. Revolution Growth, which is the later stage growth investments, companies like DraftKings and BigCommerce, Tempest, Scopely, Clear, a bunch of great companies. Revolution Ventures, which is more of the Series A kind of when companies are really starting to get scale. We've got a couple dozen companies there. And then our most recent is our Rise of the Rest seed fund. We actually have two funds. We've invested in 150 companies in 70 cities, because we really do believe innovation is happening everywhere, but too much capital is focused on entrepreneurs in a few places like a Silicon Valley. So it's been great to see this evolve. We have a great team that's trying to support entrepreneurs at every stage of their development, whether that's early seed stage or that next venture stage or the real expansion growth stage. And we've had the privilege of backing some of the greatest entrepreneurs in the country who are really changing the world.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Rise of the Rest. I know something that's near and dear to your heart is this idea that if we keep concentrating innovation and VC money in those three areas that you speak of, the US is going to fall behind, right, as far as innovation goes and entrepreneurship goes. So first off, how did we get to this place where there's so much money and funding concentrated in those areas? And second, why is it important that we kind of spread the wealth out to other regions in the US?
Well, for those who don't know the data, last year, 75% of venture capital went to just three states: California, New York, Massachusetts, 75%. So the other 47 states are fighting over just 25%. There's some big states: Michigan, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, states like that, each get less than 1% of venture capital. Florida, Texas, about 2%. California alone, about 50%. And so it's overwhelmingly focused in a few places, particularly California, particularly Northern California, obviously the Silicon Valley area. And I should point out, I love Silicon Valley. I'm proud of Silicon Valley. It's the envy of the world. It's got great momentum, obviously, as a startup ecosystem that will continue for decades. It'll be the leader of the pack in terms of startup ecosystems for as long as one can see. I just don't want to have all the capital or most of the capital focused on entrepreneurs there. We're trying to figure out ways to back entrepreneurs everywhere, which really ties in with Rise of the Rest. In terms of your question about why that's the case, I think a couple of factors. One is venture capital itself is a relatively recent phenomenon. Just a little over a half century ago, it got started. And one of the places it got started was in the San Francisco area. New York City, Boston were the key areas. So venture capital itself evolved in terms of starting in those places. The second is the Silicon Valley is a great ecosystem. There's great universities there, Stanford and Berkeley and so forth, are great successful companies that then spin off other companies. And most of the venture capitalists are based there, and most of the venture capital investments do go to companies based there. So it just creates this network effect, this increasing returns kind of dynamic, which then leads people in the rest of the country to feel like if they really want to have a shot at being part of the innovation economy, they have to move. They have to leave where they are, where they grew up or where they went to school, and go to the coast, usually go to Silicon Valley, because that's kind of where the action is. That's where the money is. We're trying to shift that dynamic.
If we could kind of look at the bright side of that for a minute, what can we learn from what, say, a Silicon Valley did over the past 2 or 3 decades, or what a Boston has done? How can we kind of use that as a model that other cities could try to replicate and turn into the next great hub in the U.S.?
There's a bunch of things, and we've actually, with our Rise of the Rest team, have published a number of playbooks that outline the different things we've learned in different cities. As I mentioned, we've invested in 70 cities. We've now visited over 44 cities by bus, visiting them, trying to understand what's happening, learn more about them, figure out ways we can drive more collaboration. So we published these free reports on the Rise of the Rest site that outlines what we think of as sort of the playbook for a thriving startup community. But briefly, there's a few I would focus on. Obviously, capital is a key one, and that's been a key focus in terms of, as we're discussing, venture capital. If where the money's in a certain place, that's where you go. I think they said Willie Sutton, with the bank robber, robbed the banks because that's where the money is. Right now, Silicon Valley is where the money is, so that ends up being an attractive place to go. The second is talent, and there's a lot of talent that is in Silicon Valley. Almost all of it's from some other place, though. I remember speaking at a conference there about 2 years ago. There were maybe 1,000 people in the audience, and I asked for a show of hands how many people grew up in the Bay Area, and it was less than 5%. Over 95% were from some other place. They went there because of that sense of opportunity. But it's been a real magnet for talent, and we've seen a brain drain all across the country. Silicon Valley has been the primary beneficiary of that. And the final one, it's a very important one, is culture. One of the great things about Silicon Valley is that sense of possibility, of wonder, of you hear a startup pitch and you say, wow, what a great idea. That could be a great company. Many parts of the country are much more cautious and risk averse. They hear a startup pitch and they don't think about why it might be successful. They think about why it might fail. And they think of as entrepreneurs as these crazy risk takers taking unrealistic risk. And if a company, an entrepreneur starts, is not successful, they view the entrepreneur as a failure, as opposed to in Silicon Valley, it's like, well, I guess they got that one wrong, but they hopefully learn some things, and maybe the next company will be more successful. So there's other factors as well, but I'd say capital and talent and culture are the three anchors that have really led to this, the success of Silicon Valley, and those are some of the lessons we're trying to take to other cities and other places.
You talk about the various waves of the startup world and of entrepreneurship, and how right now we're in the midst of the third wave. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit? And then, how does the third wave of entrepreneurship happen in places besides those three hubs?
Well, the way I think of it, and I said at the very beginning, we co-founded AOL 35 years ago, and it was really more of an idea, not really. The internet was still somewhat limited. In fact, it was still illegal back in 1985 for consumers or businesses to be on the internet. And it was built by the government, DARPA, and at the time it was restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. We had to create kind of a parallel universe, what we called online services, until a few years later we were able to get the Congress to pass a Telecom Act that commercialized access to the internet. But that first wave was getting everybody online, and it was really building the on-ramps to the servers, getting PC manufacturers to build communication modems into their PCs, getting content media companies to create content, just all the basic plumbing to build the infrastructure of the on-ramps and create content where there'd be reason to get online and services and so forth. I remember in the early days when we pushed people to try to give it a try. They say, well, it's kind of hard to get online. You have to go through a lot of steps. It's kind of expensive to be online. Back then, it was about $10 an hour typically to be connected, which was sort of intimidating. And even if you were able to, get your PC all loaded and get your communications modem working, and you finally got online, there wasn't much to do. There wasn't much content. There was nobody else to talk to. So it was still early days, and that really was that first wave of really building the internet and educating people why they should be online. That took about 20 years. Around the year 2000, we kind of shifted from the first wave to the second wave. And because that first wave was building the internet, the shift then became building on top of the internet, and building specifically software apps, mostly on smartphones on top of the internet. And of course, the great successes of the second wave, like Facebook, really were able to ride that dynamic and get really significant global adoption. The third wave is, I think, when the internet meets the real world, and it's big, important industries, important parts of our lives, healthcare, education, food and agriculture, things like that are up for grabs in the third wave. They changed a little bit in the first wave, a little bit more in the second wave. I think they'll really change a lot in the third wave. But I think it's going to require a different mindset, different playbook than worked in the second wave. And some of the lessons from that first wave, I think, are going to apply. And just briefly, I'd say there's three, what I call the P's. One is partnerships are going to matter. And the first wave wasn't about what AOL did. We had 300 partners with different companies, and together we were able to, kind of stand up the internet and commercialize and popularize the internet. Partnerships didn't really matter in the second wave. Facebook did not have partners. They launched a great app, spread broadly, and they figured out clever ways to monetize it. In the third wave, if you're really trying to disrupt healthcare, for example, partnerships are critical. Software is sort of the table stakes. It's the partnerships you build to get nurses and doctors to embrace it, and hospitals to integrate it, and health plans to pay for it, and regulators to allow it. That's kind of where the battle will shift. So partnerships are critical. Policy obviously is critical because most of these sectors are regulated, and perseverance is critical. I mean, in that first wave, we struggled mightily to kind of break through. It took us 10 years before we kind of were what people thought was an overnight success, but it was a slog for those first 10 years. There were a lot of overnight successes, true overnight successes in the second wave. In the third wave, I think it will require more perseverance. So I think those are three of the dynamics to watch. I think partnerships will matter more, policy will matter more, perseverance will matter more. And the final one, another P, I think place will matter more. In that first wave, if you really look back, it was fairly regionally distributed. AOL happened to be in the Washington, D.C. area. Hayes, the modem company, was in Atlanta. Sprint, the communications company, was in Kansas City. CompuServe, a major online service then, was in Columbus, Ohio. Some of the big PC manufacturers, IBM, was in Florida. Dell was in Austin. I could tick down other examples of it. But that first wave was fairly regionally distributed. It really was only the second wave that Silicon Valley kind of rose to prominence, even dominance, when it really became all about the software. In the third wave, given the sectors that are up for grabs, like, as I mentioned, healthcare, most of the major partners, the big companies, are in different parts of the country, and some of the most important research institutions, research universities, labs, other things, are in the middle of the country. I think it creates opportunities for more entrepreneurs to launch and scale companies all across the country. It should reduce the dominance of Silicon Valley, but only if we're paying attention, only if we're creating thriving startup communities, only if we are winning the battle for talent. So there's less of a brain drain of people leaving, more of a boomerang of people returning. If we're able to attract the venture capital, which really is the jet fuel for the innovation economy, and we're able to change some of the cultural dynamics. So more cities and more parts of the country are welcoming of entrepreneurs, encouraging of entrepreneurs.
The outlook for some of these industries that you talk about has obviously changed over the past 7 months or so. If we look at healthcare, for example, some of the changes that were happening have now accelerated because of the fact that people, didn't want to leave their home and go to the doctor. So telehealth, for example, is totally taking off. So, in this third wave, if we're talking about agriculture, healthcare, some of the industries you mentioned, how has the outlook kind of changed? In what ways have changes that were happening already accelerated, and in what ways do entrepreneurs have to approach things differently and maybe work harder or differently than they would have 7 or 8 months ago?
I completely agree that something fundamental has changed here. This pandemic, obviously, there's terrible aspects to it. 210,000 people died, tens of millions of people lost their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. It's terrible. But there is a little bit of a silver lining as it relates to this topic of the rise of the rest and more of a dispersed innovation economy. And it's really kind of two different sides of it. One is what's happening to the flow of talent, and the second is what's happened, as you're saying, the acceleration of some trends. On the flow of talent, I talked about this brain drain of people leaving. Well, guess what? In the last 7 months, a lot of people have returned, either to where they grew up or where they went to school or where they had some connection and wanted to be there while they were kind of sheltering in place. Most of those people, I think, will end up returning to where they came from, Silicon Valley or some other place. Some will end up staying, either working for their existing company but doing it remotely, or deciding to do something else in that particular place, whether that be as an entrepreneur creating a startup or joining a startup, or as a venture capitalist realizing there are kind of great opportunities there. So I think the boomerang of talent that we've been talking about, hoping for many years, probably is going to be accelerated because of this pandemic. So I said that's one of the positive silver linings of what's a very difficult situation. The other is exactly what you're saying, an acceleration of some trends. Telehealth has been bubbling for 2 decades. It dramatically accelerated in the last few months because suddenly people, as you said, weren't comfortable going to their doctor's office, so had to embrace telehealth. Doctors who were reluctant to embrace telehealth, it just wasn't what they were used to doing, had to embrace it as well. And now people realize it does work a lot of times. We're one of the companies we backed at Revolution Growth, a company called Talkspace, focuses on digital mental health. they've seen a dramatic acceleration in interest in what they're doing. And mental health is obviously a big problem for the country. Creating more convenient, affordable access to mental health experts is critically important. And telehealth is a way to do that. We've seen other trends in healthcare. A company we backed in Chicago, Tempus, is doing some really amazing things around oncology, diagnosing cancer. Also done some things around COVID, specifically trying to do some interesting things around testing. They're seeing much more interest in far more partnerships forming around what they're doing. Of course, in the area of learning, education, because many classrooms, particularly K-12, but now also colleges and universities, decided not to have physical classes. People had to get used to more remote learning. And similarly, there are a lot of teachers that didn't really like that, a lot of professors that didn't really embrace the idea of remote learning. Many of them have found it actually works pretty well. There's some different challenges associated with it for sure. And similarly on the student side, some like it more than others, but everybody's had to adjust to a new reality. As a result, you're seeing not just an acceleration of companies like Zoom, who's had a terrific run this year, but many new companies that have formed, including one that we backed with our Rise of the Rest Fund that's focused on K-12 learning from the a founder who has significant experience in education because he was the founder of Blackboard. So those are some of the trends we've also seen in mobile gaming because people do have more time. The mobile gaming sector has really taken off. A company we backed there, Scopely, has seen really dramatic growth. So there's a number of key sectors that have really were bubbling for a while and have dramatically accelerated because of this pandemic. So to me, when we take when we're able to look back and a few years from now, look back at this moment, obviously there are going to be some enormous tragedies that are part of this, and it's going to take us a while to kind of dig our way out of this set of problems. But I do think that it could end up being a tipping point for the rise of the rest in terms of talent flows and more companies starting and scaling in different parts of the country. And I think it's definitely been an acceleration for some key industry sectors that were showing some promise, and because of this new dynamic, everybody was forced out of their comfort zone and had to adopt new things, and some of those will end up sticking.
If I'm an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur and I'm looking to start up in one of these industries we're talking about, education, agriculture, healthcare, things that have been around for centuries, what's the first thing I have to do? Like, how do I identify what a pain point is in this industry that I should attack? And then how do I start to bring that idea to fruition?
Well, as you said, the first step is really identifying the particular area you want to focus on. Most of these industries, certainly healthcare, are vast and they're very complicated. So trying to figure out what your entry point, if you will, the pain point, as you said, you want to focus on is key. The second is to start building a team. I've learned that entrepreneurship is a team sport. Sometimes the founders get all the attention, they're celebrated a lot, and often that's overdone because it really is a team effort. And as I said, in the case of healthcare, but many other third wave sectors are similar, you need an interesting mix of skills. Of course, you need people on the coding side, the technology side, to build, whether it be a software or hardware product or some kind of a service that obviously is critical. But you also need people that can establish partnerships with the major health companies and with the major kind of research universities. And so the partnership, what some might call business development, but in healthcare is even a diplomacy aspect to it, to build trust and get large institutions willing to take a shot on a young kind of startup company, I think is going to be critically important. The third is I think you have to be respectful of the role of policy, and regulations are going to be in place in many of these third wave sectors, and entrepreneurs get frustrated by regulations because often regulations make it more difficult to enter markets and make it slower to innovate. That is true, but it also is natural that, and take healthcare as an example, that we do want somebody to make sure the drugs we're taking and that the medical devices we're using actually work and aren't going to hurt us as opposed to help us. So of course there are going to be some regulations associated with that. Food and agriculture, of course we want some regulations to make sure food is safe. Even things like drones, and of course there need to be some regulations so that drones don't just kind of fly anywhere, anytime, and create havoc around airports and other important places in our community. So understanding that in this third wave, there's a reason why these sectors are regulated, and sometimes the rules do need to be changed. Actually, that's one of the other accelerants in terms of the pandemic. Some rules that have put in place were relaxed because of the pandemic. Some of those I hope will stay relaxed because that will allow more innovation to happen. But the entrepreneurs who are trying to attack these third wave sectors need to be more respectful of the role of government, of policy, of regulation, because it's going to be a critical part of being successful in this third wave.
I'm going to ask you to make a prediction here. What city or region in the U.S. do you think has the best chance at becoming the next, say, San Jose or San Francisco? A city that is medium-sized and then suddenly just becomes the heart of all innovation in the U.S. What city do you think has the best chance of doing that?
Well, I always duck that question. I have 5 kids. Nobody wants to answer the question, which of your kids do you like the most? I don't like, since we've now invested in over 70 cities, visited over 40 cities, we're really trying to champion a movement around these rising cities and do what we can to help each city rise, do what we can to back more entrepreneurs building great companies in each of those cities. So I won't pick a city, but I will note that there are a number of cities that have some interesting momentum that's worth watching, including some that are kind of surprising to people. There's some that have great research universities where you have seen great development. Obviously, Seattle and Austin are among them. Now you're seeing places like Ann Arbor because of Michigan. You're seeing in Pittsburgh because of Carnegie Mellon, a lot of startup activity happening around those. Before, people would go to those great universities and leave, part of that brain drain. Now more people graduating are staying, and even some people are returning. Those are somewhat more predictable because of the strength of those research universities. The ones that are a little bit more surprising, and one city that's risen quite significantly in the last decade is Indianapolis. And that's in part because of some smart policy. The mayor and the governor were focused more on startups, less on trying to get big companies to move there or get a factory open there, more focused on building new companies, some of which could be the big companies of tomorrow. So there was a role, and there are some strong universities in that region as well. But partly that was the success of a company, ExactTarget, that got acquired for nearly $3 billion a few years ago by Salesforce. At the time, they had 1,000 employees. Now Salesforce has 2,000 employees in Indianapolis. It's actually their second largest office outside of San Francisco itself. And we've seen an ecosystem build around that. Several dozen startup companies have formed. Scott Dorsey, the founder of ExactTarget, has backed a number of companies, created an accelerator as a partner with us in the Rise of the Rest Fund. So that's an example of a city, because of the breakout success of a particular company, you're seeing broader spin-off benefits. We're also seeing great momentum in Chicago and in Denver. It really is lots of different cities that are showing real momentum. And I'm often asked which are the cities that are going to really win. Partly it's a reluctance to predict winners because we're supporting everybody, as I mentioned, but also it really depends on what these cities do in the next 10 or 20 years. If they really embrace the idea that they have a shot in emerging as a strong, thriving startup community, launching some of the companies of the future, creating some of the interesting jobs for the future, and they rally together in a collaborative way, working with the mayors and the governors, with the university presidents, with the CEOs of the big companies that are headquartered there. And they all embrace startups and say that this is part of our future, our community, of backing these companies, seeding these companies, championing these companies. Those are the cities that are going to rise the most. So it really is still kind of a little bit of a jump ball in terms of which cities really are going to be the leaders in the third wave. And it has less to do with what I think and more to do with what they do in the years to come.
Cost of living is one obvious factor. I think every New Yorker has that moment where they hear what a home costs in another state or what the rent is, and they kind of say, what am I doing here? So what are some of the other factors besides cost of living that might make an entrepreneur want to start up in a place, outside of Massachusetts, outside of New York, outside of California?
Well, certainly cost of living is important. And if you look at the data in most of these rising cities, it's less than half, sometimes much less than half the cost, whether it be as an individual raising a family, home ownership, things like that, or the companies. $1 million they raise in a rising cities will go at least twice as far as if that company was in, say, San Francisco. So that aspect is important. But there are other aspects too, as you're suggesting. One is lifestyle reasons. Some of these cities are terrific cities that people really want to live in and want to raise their families in. Maybe maybe they have some connection there. And I think we've learned in this pandemic that sometimes being a little closer to, family is a good thing, and being a little closer to, long-term friends is a good thing. So there's some, some lifestyle considerations, but there are also some real practical business considerations. I think that's where more of the focus is starting to shift. As I mentioned, some of the very best universities in the country are in these different rising cities. So the ability to access talent is much greater than people think, if you're able to create those startup ecosystems so people stay versus leave. And the expertise in the third wave, if you believe, as I've said, that partnerships are going to matter more, kind of building trust and diplomacy to be able to partner with some of the major health plans, for example, like United Health or MD Anderson or Johns Hopkins or Cleveland Clinic or Mayo, which are very important in terms of breaking through in healthcare. Those organizations are located in the middle of the country, and being closer to them probably increases your odds of being able to forge a partnership by building some trust and goodwill and a relationship, so they're willing to kind of give you a shot. So that if we are able to shift the dynamics here and get more people kind of staying where they grew up, staying where they or went to university, or if they left, boomeranging back, returning back to those cities, that we're able to get more capital formation in those cities, both in terms of angel networks locally, regional venture capitalists, as well as coastal investors paying more attention to companies around the country, and these ecosystems start really showing more and more promise, and it really are starting to kind of rise up. Then I think you will get that tipping point, and suddenly it'll become more obvious to a lot of people that maybe the dreams they hope in terms of what they're trying to build and the life they want to have with their family and the career opportunities and so forth, maybe they have a little more flexibility than they might have thought in terms of deciding where they want to live, as opposed to feeling like they have to be in a certain place or they really aren't going to have a shot.
So say there's a founder out there who is taking what we're talking about very seriously. They're based in Silicon Valley, and they're thinking, maybe I should just pick up and move my company to the Heartland, to somewhere that's less expensive. What's kind of the calculus that goes into that decision? What sorts of things do I have to think about when deciding whether that would be worth it?
Well, everybody's a little bit different, and I've just doing this the last few months during this pandemic. I've had several dozen conversations with individuals who are reassessing that. Sometimes it's somebody who basically feels like they really want to be raising their family where they grew up, and they want to be closer to other family members. I want to talk to one last week who basically has a very successful entrepreneurial career in California and decided to shelter in place, happened to be in the Washington, D.C. area, which is where Revolution is based, and having been there now a few months, says, I've decided I want to stay here, and started to look around for companies that are in that early stage of growth that can really kind of take off. Others decide strategically, because of these third wave dynamics, that maybe they are going to be advantaged if they're closer to the key partners in the industry that they're forming. One of the Rise the Rest companies we backed, a company called Freightways, is in Chattanooga. Their strategy is to build a data platform, a Bloomberg data system, if you will, for the trucking industry. Well, the trucking industry, most of the big companies happen to be headquartered in Chattanooga. So if you're building Bloomberg for trucking and you need the trucking companies to embrace you as partners, as customers and so forth, they're actually advantaged to be in Chattanooga versus in New York or San Francisco or some other place. So some of it is driven by that kind of strategic sense of kind of what's really going to be critical for some of these new third wave industries, and where it sort of going to make sense. Others decide that they are temporarily kind of be sheltering someplace and will continue to work for their existing company. Facebook, Square, many of it announced fairly flexible remote strategies. So if you want to stay and working somewhere else and still work for that company, you can. I think a lot of people will take those companies up on that, and many will stay working for those companies, but over time some will end up doing something else. And once they're in place in a community, they meet other people, they bump into people and ideas, get exposed to new opportunities, that will likely lead to some other sorts of decisions. So some of it's the economic. They do realize they can buy a house in one of these cities at a fraction of the price in San Francisco or New York, some of it is more personal, kind of family reasons. Some of it's lifestyle reason. Maybe they like biking or skiing or other things. And some of these cities give them more of that weekend flexibility. Some are doing it because of a strategic assessment of what the key dynamics are going to be in this third wave and what industries they want to target and what cities might give them that advantage. I think there are a lot of different ways to assess this. I think what's interesting to me versus just a year ago, we've been working on Rise the Rest, as you know, for a number of years. We've been saying for a number of years, at some point, we think there'll be a slowing of the brain drain of people leaving the middle of the country to go to the coast, and we'll see a boomerang of people returning. Clearly, the pandemic has been an accelerator because it has been for a lot of people, probably most people, kind of a shake the snow globe moment, a time to take a step back and assess kind of where you are, where you've been, where you want to go next. And for some people, maybe a lot of people, that will lead to a decision to move to some other place. And that should be an accelerant in terms of some of the rise the rest dynamics.
We've talked a little about how the pandemic has accelerated the remote working trend. So if I'm a founder who does want to have a remote workforce, what are some of the ways that I can attract talent from all over the country? And then how do I maintain that culture and efficiency of a workforce that would be in the office?
I think this is really a fascinating topic, and partly given my own history being in this industry for a while. I remember in that first wave, if your company was acquired by, for example, Microsoft, which was quite acquisitive, you had to move to Seattle. Microsoft really believed everybody should be in one place. 10, 15 years ago, that started shifting. They realized if they required everybody to move, not everybody would want to move, and some of the best people would choose not to move. And suddenly you paid a lot of money for a company, and you've hollowed out a little bit in terms of some of the key people. So they started saying, well, actually, we'll acquire a company, you can stay in place, and we'll build from that. The example I referenced around Salesforce in Indianapolis is an example of that. Now we're seeing people say, well, we really don't care where you live. We really want access to the best talent. And if we require you to be in a certain place, we're going to dramatically limit the amount of talent we can pull into our company in what is now a global battle for talent, which is leading to more flexible strategies around remote work. And obviously the pandemic is an accelerant of that. And there are more companies now saying, okay, maybe we should kind of, at least for some period of time, maybe permanently, have a different talent strategy and figure out ways to manage what will end up being a more dispersed workforce. It will be tricky because I think it's relatively easy to run a company if everybody's in the same place. It's actually proven to be relatively easy, I think easier than most people thought, in running a company where everybody's remote. I think it's actually being harder to run a company where half the people are in the office and half the people are remote. It's, the team dynamics, the cultural dynamics, even the trust dynamics will get much trickier. And I think there will be a kind of like the play Hamilton. You want to be in the room where it happens. And if you're remote right now, everybody's remote. So it feels like you're on a level playing field. But if you're, a minority of your company that's remote and everybody else is in the office, there may be a feeling of being left out. So I think it's going to take a number of years to figure out where this settles out. But I think where it's headed is to have more distributed workforces, give people more flexibility in terms of where they want to work. And some people will do that permanently. Some people will do that, come to the office, 1 or 2 days a week. Obviously, the big tech companies also have realized and been working for the past 5 years on having other offices. The most celebrated that got a lot of attention was Amazon with its second headquarters, but Facebook, Google, all the big companies have built up offices with thousands of employees in different parts of the country, indeed different parts of the world. That effort will continue to accelerate as well.
So in this current moment, when 3/4 of VC funding does go to those 3 states, what can a startup or a founder who's outside of one of those regions do to kind of increase their chances of getting some of that money and increase their access to that capital?
Well, there's a number of things, and obviously depends on the stage you're in. At the early stage, the seed stage, I think trying to network locally where you are and tap into the angel funding networks that do exist in in many cities, to talk to some of the regional venture capitalists that do exist in most regions around the country. That's a good way to get started. Obviously, what we're trying to do at Revolution broadly and the Rise the Rest Seed Fund specifically is to try to be catalytic there. Our strategy with Rise the Rest in particular is to partner with regional funds. We don't lead rounds, we don't take board seats. We're really trying to be catalytic capital and partner and help these regional funds scale up. And so, well, obviously, we'd be happy to talk to you as well and connect you to some of the folks that are in your particular region, and maybe there's a way for us to participate. That's at the seed stage. When you start scaling to the venture stage or the growth stage, there are some firms within the middle of the country that have the capital to scale, but that is when you need to build the relationships with the coastal investors, because that still is where most of the capital is. And so as you're scaling up, trying to figure out how to build relationships with some of the people that can write those larger checks as your company is growing becomes quite important. Over time, hopefully, we'll see more of the regional venture firms that are $50 or $100 million being $200 or $300 million, and they'll be able to write some of the larger later stage checks. But right now, generally, it starts by getting money locally, and then as you start expanding, reaching out to other larger funds, in mostly on the coast, to get the capital you need to scale.
So we've talked a lot about the geographic concentration of VC money. What about demographically? Obviously, the vast majority of funding goes to white males. So, what can people of color do? What can women do to increase their chance of getting access to some of this funding?
Really, really important point. The data here, 75% of capital going to 3 states, I find pretty shocking. The data around where the capital is going in terms of not place, but people, is frankly more shocking and troubling. Last year, over 90% of venture capital went to men, even though 50% of our country is women. Last year, even though Black Americans represent about 14% of our population, Black entrepreneurs got less than 1% of venture capital. So if you just look at the data, it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like. Kind of does matter who you know, what school you went to. Whether you have an idea, you have a shot at building a company, really a shot at the American dream. And that's why this idea of leveling the playing field and being more inclusive in terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capital, other things becomes so critical. We're trying to do what we can on the Rise the Rest Fund. About 45% of the investments we've made, I mentioned we invested in 150 companies, 45% are female founders or founders of color, which isn't what it should be, but it's better than it is for most venture funds. We've also launched a number of initiatives, including one we're doing in early December, specifically focused on Black founders. And so far, we've got 70 venture capital firms from all over the country, including the coast, to join us. What will be our first virtual Rise the Rest pitch competition. We can't obviously drive the bus right now because of the pandemic, so we're doing a virtual pitch competition. The winner of the pitch competition will get a $1 million investment, and there'll be other investments as well. And by inviting so many venture capitalists to join us for the pitch competition, agree to take meetings with Black founders, we're hopeful this can be catalytic in terms of trying to really kind of make sure Black founders, in this case, you really do have a shot and get access to the people who have the capital. It is harder typically in many of these communities where the friends and family round that is taken for granted in Silicon Valley because you just worked at Facebook or you went to school at Stanford or someplace and a bunch of people who have a bunch of money and you can cobble together the initial capital that gets started in that what's called friends and family round. Well, many people in many parts of the country don't have friends and family that have big bank accounts, and so they're not able to get going with that initial capital. So it's even more important for these people that have been disadvantaged historically to get a shot and be part of this innovation economy. And we're so far we've got a lot of people who have applied to the pitch, but the pitch is still open. If you go to tour.revolution.com, if you're a Black founder, you can participate. And if you're a venture capitalist anywhere in the country and want to join us for this, we call the equity edition of our Rise the Rest tour, please reach out. We'd love to partner with you.
Let's end with one forward-looking question. So we've talked about a lot of changes that are happening in the startup space and in VC. If I'm a company that exists today, what kinds of things can I do to future-proof myself and avoid being left behind?
Well, it's sort of like Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, said. You got to focus not on where the puck is, but where the puck is going, and position yourself for where things will be a few years down the road. That's what great entrepreneurs do. They don't just identify opportunities. They're really great at building a team, setting priorities, executing against those priorities, and always leaning in the future, kind of peering around the corners a little bit, and just get to that future maybe a little bit before other people. So some of it is that kind of mindset you have to bring, not just focusing on managing, but also imagining kind of where things are going and positioning yourself. Obviously, as I said before, because entrepreneurship is a team sport, spending a lot of your time building and managing, motivating, inspiring your team becomes critically important. If the right team, anything is possible. Without the right team, I'd argue kind of nothing is possible. So I think that's a key part as well. I think also recognizing, as I said earlier, that the playbook has changed and partnerships do matter. So figuring out ways to create alliances around your company, almost a network around your company, I think is going to be critical in the next 10 or 20 years. And being, as I said earlier as well, being respectful of the fact that some of the biggest industries of our in the world that are most up for kind of disruption, for change in this third wave are regulated. And there's a reason they're regulated, and being a little more respectful of why regulations do matter, trying to argue for why regulations should change, and also recognize, and we've seen this recently in a number of parts of what we're doing at Revolution, that regulations, well, often people just see them as ways that kind of slow down innovation or sometimes protect incumbents. They also open up new opportunities. Some of the companies we're involved in now, like Talkspace, I mentioned, in the digital mental health, telehealth space, has benefited from some of the relaxing of some of the policies around telehealth. We're also investors in sports tech, and companies like DraftKings have seen a lot of momentum because of changes in a number of different states around the laws around gaming. So thinking of policy, not just in terms of how to deal with it, but how to optimize it and what changes should be made in that industry sector to really open up more opportunity and accelerate your growth. That's the mindset that the companies we back at Revolution also got to bring to bear.
Great. That's it. Steve, thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks, Kevin. Great being with you.
Okay, take care.